Hey everybody, it's D from D&D Ditches, and today the D stands for disease, and I've failed my saving throw against it, and that's why it's been so long since my last video. So without further ado, here's more low effort unboxing. So once again, I received a few things from Noble Knight Games. So let's look through these books individually. Let's start with the Ravenloft adventure called Web of Illusion. Web of Illusion is a Ravenloft adventure released in 1993 and it's designed for character levels between 7 and 9. This booklet is slightly different from the Ravenloft modules of this era because most of them have a detachable cover and there would have been maps and other information that's contained on the interior cover, whereas Web of Illusion is released as a soft cover book, consists of 64 pages. Obviously, this adventure takes place in Ravenloft, specifically the domain called Sriraji. This domain is inspired by India and it consists of thick jungles and filled with tigers. Now we've got to remember, Ravenloft is a horror setting and it likes a lot of horror tropes. Given that the tigers feature heavily in the domain of Sriraji, it should come as no surprise that the antagonists of this domain are the Rakshasa. As the cover depicted, the Rakshasa is this humanoid creature with a tiger head. They're also quite infamous in older editions of D&D because they're immune to magic as well. You also see that both were-tigers and regular tigers also featured as enemies in this adventure. This adventure is divided into two parts. Part 1 consists of 13 scenes that the DM can drop into their game that introduces the story and introduces the premise of this adventure. And it involves the Arijani, which is the Rakshasa Lord. Given this domain is inspired by India, you also have some Indian motifs such as the priestess of Kali, Kali being a deity in Hindu mythology. There are quite a lot more artwork than the typical Ravenloft adventure. It also features the Spirit Naga being one of the monsters. Here is a piece of artwork. They're essentially a monster that has a human head and a serpentine body. And I believe they're also inspired by Indian or Hindu mythology. There is a poster map included in this adventure. We'll have a look at that afterwards. Halfway into this book, we move on to the second part of this adventure, which turns into more of a traditional dungeon crawl. And it seems like illusions will feature quite prominently in this part of the adventure. The Rakshasa is known to use a lot of illusions, so that definitely fits. This chapter is called Exploring Mahakala, Mahakala being the temple of the Arijani, which is the Rakshasa Lord. And the writing goes into describing the different parts of this temple, and I believe the map of this temple is featured in this map, so let's have a look at this map. So the left part of this map shows the domain of Sriraji. On the map, the jungles are depicted by these what appears as dots on the camera. These are actually miniature trees. The colors depict elevation, with the dark green being the closest to sea level, the light green being higher than that, and the yellow, which is in this region called Yahasha Mountains, is elevated ground up to 1,000 feet. From this map, it seems like we only have 3 towns here, here, and here, and then Baru, the accursed city, up in the mountains. So on the right hand side of this map, we have the exterior of what I assume as the temple. The temple is shaped like a tiger, which is totally fitting. And then the interior of Mahakala, and the numbers marked on the map are described in the book. Seems like there's a base level and then there is a level, I'm assuming, above. But overall, it doesn't look like a very complicated setup. Now let's move back to the book. This continues the exploration of the temple. There are different pagodas in this temple and they all have an Indian theme. So we have Savitri, Yama, Varuna, Brahman, and so on. I believe this was the only adventure that was published which took place in the domain of Sriraji, the Indian-inspired domain. Near the end of this book, we have a few pages devoted to expanding the domain of Sriraji, such as the different towns or the cities. Sriraji was covered in one of the Ravenloft campaign setting box set. Probably was not given a lot of detail. Most of the domains didn't actually get a lot of detail in that box set, so some of this will likely be new information. There's a caste system, the secret societies of this domain, and then we have the stats and background of the characters involved in this adventure. such as the Arajani, which is the Rakshasa Lord, the Were-Tiger, and Minja, the lawful good human rogue. And that was Web of Illusion. And next up, let's take a look at the Forgotten Realms supplement called Empires of the Sands. This was released in 1988 and it was technically written for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 1st edition. The product code for this was FR3, which means it was released quite early on in the life of Forgotten Realms, as the base campaign setting came out in 1987. If you open this up, you'll see that the cover is detachable, then that's what I was saying. A lot of the books in this era came with a detachable cover, and the booklet itself will be staple bound, that is loose from the cover. Sometimes they'll also include maps and other material on the interior of the cover, but I guess this was released back in 1st edition, they haven't started doing that yet. We also have 2 poster maps included with this set as well. So Empires of the Sands is a 64-page book and it's a supplement which expands upon the southern region of the continent of Faerun, specifically the lands of Arm, Tethir, and Kalimshan. There are only a few supplements published for Forgotten Realms in the 1st edition, given the setting was released in 1987 and 2nd edition came out in 1989. They only had about 2 years to publish Forgotten Realms materials for 1st edition before the edition became obsolete. So a lot of the material that was published for 1st edition Forgotten Realms will later be republished and expanded upon for 2nd edition. For example, Arm and Tethir would further be expanded upon in the box set called Lands of Intrigue, released in 1997. And Kalimshan would also receive its own box set. It would also be the last box set released for Forgotten Realms in 2nd edition, called Empires of the Shining Sea. Furthermore, the biggest city in Kalimshan called Kalimpor would also receive its own supplement book as well. So I have not read this book in full, but I suspect that most of the information that's covered in this book will be retold and expanded upon in the 2nd edition books. Now, something else about these 1st edition Forgotten Realms supplements, they were all printed on the sepia tone paper, which made it look like it was written on old parchment. Here we have Castle Spalzir, which will go on to receive 2 Avenger modules which revolves around this locale in 2nd edition. It would also be a part of the Forgotten Realms and Ravenloft crossover, as the first adventure takes place in Castle Spalzir located in Faerun, and depends on what happens in the adventure, Castle Spalzir might actually get pulled into the Domain of Dread, and then you'll have the 2nd adventure located in Ravenloft. Going back to this parchment-like presentation of these pages, it certainly was cohesive across the Forgotten Realms line, however, it made it really difficult to read, particularly if you run it through the photocopier. Now, back in the 90s, the photocopier, or some people would also call it the Xerox machine, it was quite a popular way for people to make duplicates of these pages. People might find books in the library that they would like to take a copy of, and they'll just run it through the photocopier. Or this could be a way for friends to share the same book kind of thing. But when people make copies of these pages due to this sepia tone paper, the photocopies were really difficult to read, as the darker pigments on the page would also get picked up by the machine. So the result, you had copies of these pages where it was difficult to tell what were the text and what were just the pigments from the background, because they would kind of just run together. So the book covers each of these regions and it goes into the general description, the races, the languages, the customs, the religions, the politics, the history, money, commerce, and then some of the major cities in this region. For example, there is Kalimport. Kalimshan had a Middle Eastern, Arabian type of feel about it, and you will encounter genies and other Arabian flavored creatures in this region. And this was created before the Al-Qadim setting, which came in 1992. The Al-Qadim setting being also an Arabian flavored setting. And TSR made the decision to place Zakhara, the name of the land that the Al-Qadim setting belongs to, and they placed Zakhara to the southeast of Kalimshan, which I guess kind of makes sense, but it doesn't really add much to Faerun or Forgotten Realms, given it already had an Arabian flavored place. And that is the end of the book. Now let's have a look at the maps. Both of these are horizontal maps. So the first one shows the lands of Arm and also Tethir. So at the north of this map we have Beregost, Durlag's Tower, and Nashgul. Now, if you played Baldur's Gate 1, you might recognize these names. Candlekeep will be located around about here, and then Baldur's Gate will be like further north. Arm is south of Baldur's Gate, and this is also where Baldur's Gate 2 takes place. There is Athkatla, And further south across from the Forest of Tithir is the region of Tithir. The expansion of Baldur's Gate 2 called Throne of Baal takes place in Tithir, although the story is fairly short and it doesn't really do much with Tithir, as most of the story revolved around the conclusion of the Baalspawn saga. If we move east, we'll get to the Snowflake Mountains. And the second map is located further south from Tithir and it goes into Kalimshan. A large part of Kalimshan is the Kalim Desert. Kalimport is right there on the coast. And if you go further south, that's just a shining sea with not much happening here. Further east, we have the Forest of Myr and the Spider Swamp. So that was the Empires of the Sands. This is the first time that this region of Faerun is expanded upon. And it'll be expanded upon even further in 2nd edition. So we can have a look at those products at a later date. Next up, let's take a look at the adventure called Marco Volo Journey. This was released in 1994 and is part of a trilogy of adventures. They all relate to Marco Volo and the names are Departure, Journey, and Arrival. Obviously, with those titles, you have an idea what this adventure is about. TSR liked a lot of trilogies. A lot of adventures are written in a trilogy. The other thing to know that Marco Volo is not the same person as Volo, short for Volotham Gadam. But there is a connection in this adventure. Journey is the only one of the trilogy that I currently own, so maybe when I acquire the other 2 volumes I can do a full review on this trilogy. This adventure is designed for 4 to 8 characters between levels 6 and 8. The cover artwork for all 3 adventures involve these 3 characters, but I don't actually think that they're characters in this story, and it's not Marco Volo either. I think they're meant to depict the player characters. So I'm going to give you the brief story and what happened previously. So this piece of artwork, that's supposed to be Marco Volo. Marco Volo's real name is Marcus Wands. He is a rogue and a bard of some renown, and in 2nd edition he is of the bard class. He is also a bit of a troublemaker. He is not necessarily evil, more like free-spirited, or has a penchant for a little bit of mayhem. So his uncle named Masker Wands wanted to toughen him up. And that's where the PCs come in. They're given a mission to take Marcus from Waterdeep to Shadowdale, with his uncle thinking that doing some traveling is going to straighten him up. In a way, this trilogy is a little bit like the opposite of the Avatar trilogy, because the Avatar trilogy started in Shadowdale, ended in Waterdeep. This is the other way around. Now, obviously, Marcus was up to no good, and he stole an artifact from a wizard called Sabar, but then he planted some false evidence implicating the actual Volo, meaning Volotham Gadam, as the culprit who stole this artifact. Now, it kind of worked. The wizard bought into his planted false evidence and is convinced that Volo stole the artifact. However, he also gets confused and thinks that Marco Volo is Volo in disguise, meaning the bad guy is now trying to capture Marco Volo, aka Marcus Wands, aka your traveling companion, and hence insert mayhem here. So Marcus Wands, aka Marco Volo, is a 6th level bard, and he is your traveling companion. There are a few other NPCs involved in this adventure. Now, I believe all of these adventures are 32 pages. First adventure started in Waterdeep, and by the 2nd adventure, your party has made its way to Burdusk, which is a stone throw away from Elturel, which is a stone throw away from Baldur's Gate. You will then make your way into Dragonspear Castle, which is a castle that has since been abandoned. Now, I've only just had a brief look through at this adventure. It looks like there's quite a few social and roleplay challenges. As Marco Volo is a bit of a wanted man, you will need to fight off the pursuers, people who are trying to capture him essentially. And because the players are hired by the uncle to protect him, I guess most of this is going to be an escort mission. I think the story in this trilogy is quite humorous. I wouldn't mind reading through this entire trilogy in full, and perhaps even running it at some point. That was Marco Volo Journey. After about 100 layers of bubble wrap, we finally unwrapped it. This is the Forgotten Realms Netheril Empire of Magic box set. Let's open up the plastic. This box set was released in 1996. Even though this box set has the Forgotten Realms logo, and technically it is set within the Forgotten Realms, it actually introduces a small setting by the name of Arcane Age, and this is the logo. The Forgotten Realms setting actually contains several sub-settings that were published. Arcane Age is one of them. We've also got Maztica as well as the Horde. All of these sub-settings starts with a box set and are accompanied by 3 additional supplements. The Arcane Age subsetting lets you go back in time of Faerun's history and lets you play the game set in a distant bygone era. And in this case, this is during the Netheril Empire, which is set almost 5,000 years ago. The other Arcane Age supplements expands upon other periods of history. Within this box set, we have a larger booklet and a smaller booklet, along with 2 poster maps. So we're going to take a look at the Winds of Netheril book first of all. This book is 128 pages. And it starts with an introduction on the Age of Netheril. Now, if you played Baldur's Gate 3, you will know a little bit about the Netheril Empire. Thousands of years ago on Faerun, magic was unrestricted, which allowed powerful archmages to construct cities on floating islands, towering above the surface of Faerun. This section gives us the history and the different ages during the Netheril Empire. The first age started almost 5,000 years ago. In Dale Reckoning date, that would be minus 3859, but the Netheril used their own calendar system called NY, which stood for Netheril years. The first age was the birth of the Netheril Empire. I want to cover the Arcane Age setting in further detail in its own video, so I won't go into a lot of detail in this. Next came the discovery of the Nether Scrolls, which brought along the Nether Age. The reason why the empire was called Netheril, the Shaman King at the time, his name was Nether, so the kingdom was named after him. And then came the advancement in magic and floating cities. Then it moved into the Silver and then the Golden Age, which was when the Chronomancer was born. Spelljamming technology and realm space were discovered in the next age, and then we have the Shadow Age, which is the time of Karsus. Thanks to Baldur's Gate 3, most of the D&D fandom should now be aware of Karsus' folly, which is essentially this guy named Karsus who wanted to be a god and researched extremely powerful magic up to 12th level. Karsus gained more and more power, and eventually in an incident called the Fall, which made magic unstable and the weave was about to collapse. And it was at this moment Mistral, the then goddess of magic, sacrificed herself to repair the weave and was reborn as Mistra. However, in that instant when Mistral sacrificed herself, all magic on the face of Faerun ceased to function, which meant all of these floating islands which were kept afloat using magic lost all their power and they came crashing down to earth, effectively ending the Netherese Empire. It was then after this point, the new goddess of magic, Mistra, who has been reborn, placed a cap on the power level of spells that mortals are able to use, so this does not happen again. As of the current time period, which is 1370 DR when this book was written, so history is all well and good, but how are you going to use that in your own game? Well, the next section provides you some advice on how to incorporate this into your own game. One of the recommendation is through time traveling, that is to bring the adventurers who exist in the current time period, let's say 1370, back to the Netherese days. So there are a few suggestions here with time travel. And the other way is to start the campaign during the Netherese time period, and this book provides you with some outline on how the different races fared during that time, what the classes were available during the Netherese period. So obviously, during the height of magic, the magic using classes are also quite different. Arcane spellcasters were called Arcanists. Here we have the spell progression up to level 45. Weave Depth is the level of spell that they have access to, and it goes up to level 12. So number of arcs, this looks like kind of like a mana system. The spell progression is not too different from 2nd edition wizard progression. If you consider a first level spell slot worth 1 point, and a 2nd level spell slot as worth 2 points, you'll see the mana system is fairly consistent with the spell slots. However, it seems like this class does not use spell slots, making magic a lot more flexible. Divine casters were still called priests. However, the gods that existed during this period were a little bit different. There's some familiar names like Shah and Saluna. Anyone who played Baldur's Gate 3 should recognize Yergol. If you played many Forgotten Realms games, most of these names should still feel familiar to you. Pre-spell progressions are also similar as well, except divine spells were called winds. Wind depth is the level of a spell that you have access to, with the number of winds also being a mana system of sort. We also have bards who are arcane spellcasters, and the other classes are also covered here as well. So the next section is also quite interesting, and it refers to the original names of the spells. In 2nd edition, you have spells like Melf's Minute Meteors or Melf's Acid Arrow, which were originated by the mage named Melf. What if I was to tell you all of the mundane spells were originated during the Netheril era? For example, the 1st level spell called Enlarge was originally called Axis Growth. Light was originally called Brightfinger's Light. Sleep was originally called Afterin Sleep. Protection from Evil was originally called Medal's Dispel Evil. Even some of the higher level spells here, for example, Meteor Swarm was originally called Maven's Meteors. This provides a lot of flavor in history for some of these mundane spells that we just now take for granted, as it identifies the original Archmage that came up with that spell. The next section is the spell introduction by year. This is another one which adds a lot of flavor as it tells you when a certain spell was invented. Because magic is so prolific during the Netheril era, everybody can use magic, including just regular people off the streets. This table shows you how many cantrips a regular person would have access to, depending on their intelligence score. And a lot of these cantrips were used by regular people in their day-to-day life and their trades. For example, here is the starting cantrips, determined by their profession. Then it goes into the type of equipment that's appropriate for this time period. And then a section on these antiquated gods which were worshipped at the time. The first one is a Monitor, who is the sun god. And contained within these pages, we also have details on the specialty priests of that faith. Jenath was the god of nature, and his specialty priests were druids. Yurgo, the god of death. Koza, the god of storms. Moenda, the god of rotting death, decay, and corruption, who is a chaotic evil god. Mistral, the goddess of magic. Selûne, who is still around. Now, Selûne and Shah, who should be the next one on the list, were some of the first gods that were created. They were essentially the gods of the two moons. And that's the reason why they were around in ancient history, and also part of the reason why they're still around. Targus was the god of war, and Tyche was the god of luck, who I believe would then go on to get split into two goddesses, Tymora symbolizing good luck, and I think Bathsheba, who was the goddess of bad luck. The next section is called Concordance. Now, these include entries focusing on landmarks, towns, places, but as well as people. They are in alphabetical order, which is something that I really do not like, because there is no rhyme or reason to what order you should read these entries in. It reminds me a bit of the 1st edition Forgotten Realms campaign setting. That was how everything was organized, and it just made it very difficult to absorb the information. For example, now you have this section on Karsus, which refers to the person, but then you have something like the Macked Lake, which is clearly a landmark. And then you have something like Northreach, which was a dwarven settlement, and it lists the changes through the different eras, because this box set covers up to about a 5,000 year history. As this setting is so broad, I would say what's contained here is hardly enough. But given this is a setting within a setting, I think we're really lucky to have received this box set at all. Because if you look at some of the other settings like Dragonlance or Dark Sun, you probably get a lot of players that say, hey, I would have really loved to play in Athos during the Green Age or the Blue Age, like a distant past, but you only have a little bit of lore to go on what that age was like. So this Arcane Age of supplements is such a boon for Forgotten Realms players, as it gives you quite a lot of information on different periods of Faerun's history, the ones that people would have really liked to play. There is a certain appeal to play within an age where magic is completely unrestricted. You can cast up to level 12 magic. There's definitely an appeal to playing during this timeline. The next section goes through the laws that were enforced during this period. You're given random tables to generate businesses or buildings or other infrastructure which fits the flavor of this setting during this time period. And then we have some noteworthy landmarks in this city, such as Carmenden's Finery, which is a shop that sold clothing, but also comes with a backstory on how he got his goods. Lacklow's Cremes and Candies, which is a candy store. There is the library, the Museum of Heavy Magic, where each room had a different mixture of magic effect to create a sort of entertainment and historical archives of Netheril events. And then towards the end of the book, we have a list of NPCs. These are also divided into the different ages. We could do with many more NPCs, but at least this is a start. The Golden Age, being the greatest period of the Netheril history, is given the most number of NPCs. There is Axa, which we recognize as the person who invented the Enlarge spell. Axa the Destroyer was a scraggy-haired arcanist who sought control over magic that destroyed or altered objects. He was most famous for inventing the Disintegrate spell. And then it goes into the Age of Discovery, and then the Shadowed Age, which is right before the Fall. Cassis was a 41st level arcanist, which explains why he was able to use 12th level spells. And then a small section on what happens after the Fall if you want to continue the adventure, what happened to the people that survived, and then we are given some new monsters. There is the Faerun, which is also the creature that is on the cover artwork. And then the Shan, which are beings that seek mastery of magic. Their first appearance on Faerun coincides with Netheril's Shadowed Age. And then finally we have the Tomb Trapper. They're not natural creatures, and their existence can be traced back to the very beginning of the Shadowed Age, where a group of arcanists created them to seek out the source of magical drain that was beginning to reach across Netheril. In the last few pages we have the spells divided by specialization. The spell schools weren't around at the time. The arcane spells were divided into inventive, mentalism, and variation. And then we have the pre-spells after that. The next book is called Encyclopedia Arcana. This is only 32 pages, and this booklet provides us with some new magic items as well as spells. Given this was set during the time of unrestricted magical powers, I'm expecting that these items and these spells could be maybe more powerful than your usual stuff. Shadowlands were discovered during this period, and they were naturally occurring black rocks that could contain a single spell that were cast into them. Thus, a spell like known as Fireball could be cast onto a single Shadowland, and then used by any creature when needed by hurling the stone at the enemy, and the magical fireball contained within a rock would be released. So this is similar to something like a ring of spell storing. It could be charged with any spell and then can be used by anybody, effectively making non-spellcasters pseudo-spellcasters. There are the Skimmers, which are small dangerous boats propelled by snared air elementals. So these are floating boats powered by air elementals, which is quite clever. Here are the new spells, which are the 10th, 11th, and 12th level spells. It also makes sense that nobody's ever heard of these spells, given that the power of these levels are above level 9 spells, which don't exist in the current day. For example, Voldik's Fair Sail, which is a 10th level spell, allows you to travel through the prime material plane, potentially between different crystal spheres without a spelljammer. It's not that impressive considering you could do something similar using the teleport spell. There's a lot more terms and conditions with teleport, of course, but it's probably a case with teleport being overpowered rather than this spell being underpowered. And then we'll go into the pre-spells. These are divided into the different gods. For example, Amonitar and Urgol. Even though arcane spells could go up to 12th level in this period, divine spells are still capped at level 7, although quest spells which were introduced in Tomes of Magic were also available. Given these new pre-spells are not beyond the level cap, if you like these, you could make the argument that these spells could be carried over to the current timeline. Even if these gods are no longer around, it's implied that whoever that took over their portfolio should, in theory, still have access to their powers. And that is the end of this booklet. Now let's have a look at the next map. So this first one shows a Netheril at the Fall 3520 NY. Now because I haven't read the book, I am unsure about any of these locations. When I covered this setting in its own video, I'll be able to give a lot more detail about this. This looked like what could be the land on Faerun that's beneath the island. And I'm thinking maybe this is the area that eventually became the Anarok Desert. And on the other side we have some artwork. Here we have a side view of the floating island. You see that some of the cities are on the opposite side. And this kind of reminds me a bit of the Rock of Brawl in the Spelljammer setting, with what looks like an identical gravity plane, which is a horizontal line across the center of this island. So the gravity on the top side is aligned downward, and the gravity on the bottom side is aligned upward. There's some more artwork depicting what the city would have looked like, and then a more close-up version of the map of the city. And then And then a few more pieces of artwork. So the architecture looks a lot more modern compared to a lot of the Forgotten Realms stuff. This kind of almost looks like it's Victorian. And these buildings with the columns look a bit like they were Roman inspired. The second one shows Netheril at its height, the Golden Age. You'll see that the land looks quite similar to the first map, except this area has not become a desert as of yet. So I definitely think this is the land prior to what became the Anarok. And the previous map was immediately after the fall, which turned this entire landmass into a desert. And the other side gives us a map of what looks like Faerun. It's called Netheril's Frontier as drawn by the Terracia 1491 NY. So this definitely looks like Faerun in the past. The glacier, that's obviously Icewind Dale. Barbarians, they hate magic, which is consistent with this area. This is obviously the Spine of the World Mountains. And as you move southward, this is clearly the Sword Coast, which would later have cities like Neverwinter and Waterdeep. And further south, Baldur's Gate. And when we move eastward, we have the High Forest. Faerun had a lot more forests back in the day, it seems like. And as you move further east, it gets hillier. And that was Netheril, Empire of Magic. This next one's also from Noble Knight Games. So what happened was I ordered this box. The next day my order was shipped, and then the day after they announced that they had a sale. So I ended up buying more stuff due to the sale. This usually happens when I buy from Noble Knight. Seems like whenever I buy things at full price, it's followed immediately by a sale. So we're going to take a look at these. First one being the Forgotten Realms supplement called Moonshae. This supplement was released in 1987 and it was released shortly after the original Forgotten Realms campaign set. Notice the product code is FR2, which was released prior to Empires of the Sands, which we looked at earlier in this video, which was FR3. Once again, the cover is detachable and inside contains a 64-page booklet as well as a poster map. And you should recognize just by the color of this booklet that this was released for first edition. We're going to take a look at the map before we go into the booklet. This is a double-sided map. So the vertical version of this map is a more zoomed in version. The Moonshae Isles are a cluster of islands off the Sword Coast, with Gwyneth being, I believe, the most settled island. And the other side of this map is a more zoomed out version of the Isles. So to the east of Moonshae Isles, sort of in this direction, would be where the Sword Coast is. And towards the west of Moonshae, we have the Trackless Sea. And if you move further west, you are going to eventually hit the continent of Mastika. So the inspiration for the Moonshae Isles, well, that's going to be different, depends on who you ask. Some people say it's based off the British Isles. Some people say it has more of an Irish Gaelic type of influence. So you're looking at creatures like leprechauns, fairies, giants. I think the cover artwork gives you some inspiration on what you're going to find here. We have a unicorn, and this looks like a leprechaun or a gnome of some type. There is also a large druidic presence on these isles, taking inspiration from the Celtic Druids from Ireland and the British Isles. Beyond that, I don't know too much about the Moonshae Isles. However, the origin of the Moonshae Isles is actually quite an interesting story. So originally, the Moonshae Isles was supposed to be developed by TSR in UK, and this was going to be a separate campaign setting that was going to take inspiration from the legends and the folklore from the British Isles. But then at some point, there was some disagreement. I don't exactly know what happened between TSR UK and US, but essentially they disagreed on this project, and it was more or less scrapped. However, at this point, Douglas Niles, who wrote this product, he was actually in the process of writing a 3-book trilogy based on this campaign setting. While we're on this page, I can see there are several random encounter tables given for the different types of terrains. So the type of creatures here, we've got leprechaun, wyvern, hippogriff, griffin, harpies, fearbog, dryads. There's a lot of woodland creatures, fairy dragon, centaurs, giants, sylphs, selkies. So these islands have a very strong woodlands vibe, and it certainly makes a lot of sense why it will be settled by predominantly druids. So the patron deity of the Isles is the Earth Mother, while the rest of Faerun would know her as Shantia, the Earth Goddess. So anyway, I was telling the story about the Moonshae novels written by Douglas Nile. So he was halfway through writing this novel, except at this point it seemed like the Moonshae Isle would never see print. So somebody at TSR US just came up with an idea. Why not bring the Moonshae Isles into Forgotten Realms? As at this point they were still working on the Forgotten Realms campaign setting, and there was a set of islands called the Moonshae Isles that already existed in Ed Greenwood's original Forgotten Realms, except they were a little bit different. So in the end they changed the original Moonshae Isles that Ed Greenwood had to more resemble Douglas's interpretation per his novels. So with that arrangement, Douglas Niles had a fantasy world to set his novels in, and Forgotten Realms gained a trilogy of novels to promote the setting. Everybody wins. I heard some people who read the first novel, I believe was called Darkness on Moonshae. They say it's a good novel, it just doesn't feel very Forgotten Realms. It feels very detached from the rest of the realms, apart from like a couple of names. And the reason for that is because it wasn't originally supposed to be a Forgotten Realms novel. And then with the second and the third book, they ended up doing more ties from the Forgotten Realms into the novels. For example, there was a story around Bol, the god of murder, and I believe the major characters in the novels also get a mention in this book. I sometimes see DMs set their games on the Moonshae Isles who want to remove their game away from the rest of the realms. So if you're looking for a place to set your game that is high in Celtic and Welsh flavor, with a lot of fae, a lot of woodlands, a lot of nature, not a lot of cities, divorced from a lot of what's happening in the realms, maybe give the Moonshae Isles a go. So the information that's contained in this book is just your standard usual fare, where it describes the different islands, the different locales, cities, culture, creatures, some of the NPCs. Towards the end, the book gives you a few ideas on how to start off your game on the Moonshae Isles, and then a few magic items that's got a druidic flavor to it. For example, the yoke of boar harnessing. There are a pair of boars that can be used to harness a chariot, cart, plow, or other towed objects, or alternatively, you can use them for riding. Or how about the mug of plenty? Essentially a mug of beer that will fill itself. How about a variety of magical sickles, given it has an agricultural origin? So that was Moonshae. The next one we're going to take a look at is called How the Mighty Are Fallen. Notice this book also bears the Arcane Age logo, as this is one of the 3 supplements released for Arcane Age. This book is 64 pages and is an adventure designed for characters of level 11 to 14, and this is set during the Netheril Empire, specifically the final days of the Empire right before the fall. So in this adventure, you are actually working directly with Castus himself as he prepares to cast his level 12 spell that is going to make him a god, essentially. The adventure starts in a port town called Ravenloft. It is also the heart of Netheril's spelljamming activities, so the PCs could be a part of a spelljammer crew who recently returned from realm space from a space expedition. There is a flowchart on the adventure structure. The vertical line right down the middle of this page represents the main quests in this adventure, but you're also given the opportunity to take on some of these side adventures if you choose to. This is the map of Yeoman's Loft. Given its use mostly as a spelljammer port, there are many docks where the ships are anchored. The following pages describes this town in more detail. So next chapter is essentially just overland travel. Here is a map of some of the locales on this island. Quite a significant part in the middle of this adventure just seems to be random encounters. We have the random encounter tables, and the text just mostly explains the type of creatures, the monsters, and the other random encounters in this area, as well as the planned encounters. So there is a graveyard, and right in the middle of the book we have the side quests. And if we go back to the adventure flowchart, you could potentially take on most of these side quests before you trek through the Eastern Forests. So this gives the first half of the adventure more of a sandbox, non-linear type of vibe, where you can choose to do the quests and go to the different places at your own leisure. So about halfway through this adventure, you meet Castus, and he gives you a mission, because in order for him to cast his 12th level spell, he requires some additional material components, and he asks the party to go and acquire those components for him. So specifically, there are 2 ingredients that you need to procure for him. First of all, there is a gizzard of a gold dragon, and the pituitary gland of a Tarrasque. If we look back on the cover, this is a Tarrasque. So you do end up having to fight a Tarrasque at some point in this adventure. You might be thinking, this adventure is only designed for characters between 11th and 14th level. Aren't these monsters a little bit too powerful for a party of this level? Technically yes, however, you're not actually taking on these monsters on your own. There is support from other NPCs as well. For example, in the Tarask fight, you are aided by a band of barbarians. This adventure also encourages you to go shopping at the marketplace. Probably so that it can introduce all those new magic items that we just saw in the box set. And it could also help you with the fight against the Tarask. So at the end of this adventure, you need to face an undead necromancer, also known as the Lich Lord. And while you're facing the Lich Lord, casters will be casting his spell. And the rest of it is pretty much history. So towards the end of this book, after Caster's Folly and The Fall, it tells you how you can continue the adventure. Obviously, magic has been changed. Arcanists became mages, magic is more restricted. There is a cap placed on arcane magic in that it cannot exceed beyond 9th level. And then it gives you a few ideas on where to take the adventure next. And then there are some more spells that's been introduced in this adventure. So something that's interesting in the original Arcane Age box set was the idea of traveling back in time. Maybe you have some adventurers from current day Faerun and they were able to travel back in time to the Netheril Empire. Maybe they could convince casters not to cast his ultimate spell, and then perhaps save Netheril from extinction. So that's definitely something to think about if you wish to run this campaign. Maybe give your players the choice. Instead of helping casters by giving him the material components for his spell, they could try to convince him not to cast it instead and be like, hey, we're from the future, we know what this spell's gonna do. Read our minds if you don't believe us. And explore what would have happened if the kingdom of Netheril survived. So towards the end of the book, you have some rumors and quest hooks, and then a monster entry for the Netheril zombie. So that was How the Mighty Are Fallen. This book is called The Grand History of the Realms, and it was released in 2007 as a hardcover book for 3.5th edition. It was one of the last 3.5 books released, if not the last. Now there's actually some interesting history about this book, in that it originally started its life as a fan-made book. So Brian R. James was the original author. He went through all of the officially published Forgotten Realms source books, collated all of the events that happened throughout history in Faerun, put it all into a PDF document and released it online for free. We have a foreword written by Richard Baker that kind of summarizes what happened. So essentially he said, one afternoon in 2006, he was looking around the message boards on Wizards of the Coast website and came across this link to a 100-page PDF document compiled by Brian. He was so impressed by this document that he forwarded it around to some of the other managers in Wizards of the Coast, such as Chris Perkins. They all agreed it was a great piece of work, and then they toyed around with the idea of contacting this guy, paying him for this work, and publishing this as an official book. So that was exactly what happened, and that is the story of a fan-made lore book that became an official source book. So the calendar begins at negative 35,000 DR, which was also known as the Days of Thunder. During this time, all of the continents in Faerun were all connected together in a single landmass. Here is the map. This is kind of the same idea as prehistoric Earth history, sometimes referred to as Pangea, where all of the continents were connected, and it was through hundreds and thousands of years where the continents separated and moved away from each other, resulting in our world as it is today. There's very little known about the Days of Thunder, although occasionally I do see a post online with somebody saying, hey, wouldn't it be fun if I set my game during Days of Thunder? Yeah, it definitely would be, except you would have had to create all of that lore yourself. This book is not going to help you that much, unfortunately. And then came the Dawn Ages and then the first flowering. It was during this period that we had the first sundering. I think that was when the Tablet of Fate was originally created, which contained like rules and the laws for Faerun and its gods and something like that. I'm not really that well versed in ancient history, unfortunately. And the next era were the Crown Wars, which happened almost 15,000 years ago from current day Faerun. There were several Crown Wars, and it went on for several thousand years, and it was mostly an elf on elf conflict where different clans and different, I guess, ancestries of elves fought against each other. It was during this period where the rest of the elves cast out the dark elves, also known as Drow. Like, written in this entry, Corellon's magic, as directed through his priest and high mages, transformed the dark elves into the Drow. Whether by magic or weakness that banished them from the sunlit lands, all Drow retreat within 2 months, passing into the Underdark. So essentially they forced them all underground to live in the Underdark. I'm currently playing in a 2nd edition Forgotten Realms game, and the plot of this game revolves around the First Crown War, so that's why I know a little bit about that. So the earlier on in history in this book, there's less written about them. As you progress to more recent history, you're going to find more and more entries, and that's generally how history works. We know a lot more about things that's more recent. Now, I'm not going to go through every page because I don't know the majority of the Faerun history. However, earlier on in this video, we went through the Arcane Age box set with the Age of the Netheril. And this page chronicles the start of the Netheril kingdoms. In minus 3869 DR, the charismatic 20-year-old priest Nether the Elder rises to rule the fishing village of Gurs in the north of Faerun. If you remember, we spoke about the rise of the Netheril civilization. It was headed by the shaman king named Nether. So that was the first time his name was recorded in history. 5 years later, in minus 3864, an event happened and the rise of House Bainray as the first house of Menzoberranzan. If you watched my unboxing for last month, I went through the box set called Menzoberranzan, where it talked about the different houses of the city. So the first house of Bainray is as old as the Netheril civilization, and they're still around in the current day of the Faerunian calendar. Let that sink in for a bit. And the next entry gives us the 300-year period of the first age of the Netheril civilization. It seems like a lot happened during the years on this page. If we go back a few entries, in minus 3983 DR, the city of Cormanthor, now Mithranor, is founded with the summoning of the Rule Tower. So once again, Mithranor comes up time and time again in 2nd edition products, as well as its original name, which is the city of Cormanthor. Now remember how I said that the Arcane Age product line had a box set plus 3 other supplements? In this video, we looked at the box set and one of the supplements. The other 2 supplements released for Arcane Age actually revolves around Cormanthor. So that is another civilization, another time period in history where you could play through using those supplements. Hopefully I'll get both of those books soon and then we can look at that together. Alright, so we've got Age of Humanity. We're going to skip forward a little bit. Now, I have read the original version of this book, the free fan version. The date entry is pretty much the same, except the original book has some really odd formatting choices with presentation because they will use different colored fonts, and some of the text will be in lime green and some of it will be in pink. And it's a very odd choice. There must have been some reason why they use all these different colors, but it was just really confusing why that was, and it was not pleasant on the eye. So this formatting with a universal black font is like 100 times better. In addition to that, the original document also had no pictures, there was no artwork, and they've also put in these fun little in-universe excerpts written by people within the setting to give it more flavor, and I also appreciate the different maps of the different eras. So this was the map of Faerun for the year minus 626. While we're on this page, we looked at the Moonshae Isles earlier on, but I didn't have a map of Faerun to show you exactly where Moonshae is located. So essentially this group of islands, that's Moonshae. So back in this era, they were called Sonoria. And of course, located where the modern day Anorok Desert would be, this is Netheril. So there are more of these fun inserts that makes the lore a lot more interesting to read. So most of this art's quite good. So one of the few complaints that I have with 3rd edition was just the way that the words are wrapped around the artwork. I mean, this book's not too bad, but some of the ones that I have seen, there's some really dodgy formatting. It made it quite difficult to read. There's probably even more art in here compared to a typical 3.5 book. It's like there's a piece of artwork almost every other page. This is really quite surprising. But I guess they're also not commissioning most of this artwork. They're probably just reusing the artwork, but I still appreciate that. Here we have some tables for the monarchies of Faerun, and it's organized into regions or countries. For example, it starts with Aglarond and then goes into Orm. With the different dynasties, their name, year of birth, the years that they were in power, and just a brief blurb about them. This is a really great resource for anyone who wants to do a lot of stories revolved around royalty and lineages. Obviously, this is not to the birthright level of detail, but with a little bit of work on the DM's part, you can use it to flesh out like a royal family tree. Now, there's something noteworthy about this being one of the last, if not the last, Forgotten Realms product, in that it only contains Forgotten Realms lore up until the end of 3rd edition, which means that it doesn't contain anything to do with the Spell Plague. The Spell Plague is what they invented to change the Forgotten Realms for the 4th edition. It made a lot of controversial changes. It was pretty much universally hated by the fans and the creators themselves. I know a few DMs that actively avoids the Spell Plague, even if they're currently playing in 5th edition, and some of them will just revert the timeline back into the 2nd or 3rd edition. And if you're one of these DMs, then this book is definitely a great resource for you because it has everything that you want and nothing that you don't. So we're getting into the 1200s and you can see that more and more things happen. And as we move into the 1300s, you'll see that there are multiple entries per year, separated by these lines, kind of like bullet points kind of thing. Here you're going to start seeing the names in some of the movers and shakers in 2nd and 3rd edition. For example, 1307 DR, King Azun IV was born. He was the king of Cormier. Now, if you didn't know, every year in Forgotten Realms has a name to it. And I believe, I'm just recalling from memory, that they were based on the prophecies of Alondo the Seer. He cited a lot of prophecies on what's going to happen in the future, but in a specific year, and they would name that year after their prophecies. So now we're moving on to 1356. This is 1 year prior to the 1st edition timeline, which is 1357. And you can see there's like so many things that happened during that year. A lot of it's from novels, like Drizzt, Artemis. And then as we move into 1357, Year of the Prince, this is specifically the year that 1st edition began. There are even more events. Some of these entries also correspond to the adventures that's taken place. Most of the official adventures that's been published are canon, and they'll be set within a certain year, and then there is generally a canon ending to them, even if something different might have happened in your adventure. And when we move into the end of this timeline, it's actually broken down even further to months and dates, so you will have an exact date when something happened. And our timeline ends at 1385, Year of the Blue Fire. And that was when Cyric and Shah murdered Mystra. I believe this happened in one of the novels. And when Mystra dies, the weave goes out with her. So this is the event which began the Spell Plague, which started 4th editions. The history book literally ends on this event. And that's the end of this book. Now, there was something that was in the original fan version of this book that I wish that they had retained. It was that at the end of the book that they had several pages worth of tables where it lists out all of the years and the name for each of the years. So if you wanted to get a specific name for the year that you're thinking of for whatever reason, you would have had a good reference. But I still have a digital copy of that anyway if I need it. But as for the print copy of the Grand History of the Realms, it definitely is a significant improvement. I'm not one of these people who can sit down and read through this entire book because I find reading history extremely dry. I think this is more useful as a source of reference. If you wanted to find out what happened in a specific year, or if you wanted to play an adventure that's set within a specific year or specific era, you can look it up and see what else happened and take that as an inspiration on what else is happening in the realms while you're running your adventure. This next one is called A Mighty Fortress, which is a part of the Historical Reference series, which are these green cover books, and this one was released in 1992, and HR4 denotes this being the 4th book released in the Historical Reference series, in which there are 7 books in this series in total. Each of these Historical Reference books is a mini campaign setting which is set within a certain historical period within our own world. So when I first saw the title A Mighty Fortress, I thought this book covered a particular large city within history, but that's actually a bit of a misnomer because A Mighty Fortress was taken from the first verse of the hymn A Mighty Fortress by Martin Luther, and it says, "A mighty fortress is our God, a trusty shield and weapon. He helps us free from every need that hath us now overtaken. The old evil foe now means deadly woe, deep guile and great might. Are his dread arms in flight, on earth is not his equal." This book in particular covers what we would call the Elizabethan period, the time of Queen Elizabeth I of England. There is her portrait. The timeline covered in this book is between 1500 and 1650. Centers mostly in Europe. You've got the British Isles, France, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, and the events during this period. Last month we went through the historical reference book for the Crusades, which I knew practically nothing about. Whereas during the Elizabethan era, this is an era that has been covered quite a lot in pop culture. This is the period of Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen. We had the Tudors, Henry VIII, the Inquisition, and the like. The book then summarizes the historical wars that took place during this time, and this was also the period where the New World was being discovered. We have a timeline from 1500 to 1650. For example, in the year 1500, Brazil was discovered. This was also the tail end of Christopher Columbus's journeys. Henry VIII became King of England in 1509, and he married Anne Boleyn in 1533. So there was a lot of famous people and famous events which happened during this time. In the late 1500s, we also have William Shakespeare. The early 1600s had Guy Fawkes. Back in the 90s, I grew up in New Zealand, and November 5th was called Guy Fawkes Day. And on Guy Fawkes Day, everyone would light fireworks. And the reason for that was something that he did. So back in 1605, the gunpowder plot is foiled. Guy Fawkes, intending to blow up the House of Lords while James I is present, is found and arrested in the cellars of Parliament. So he wanted to blow up Parliament using gunpowder. So what did we do back in the 90s? Celebrate that by lighting fireworks on November the 5th. And towards the end of the era being covered in this book, we have the time of Charles II, who was famous for restoring the crown jewels. I visited London a couple of years ago and learned a bit about British history while I was there, which brings me to the next point I want to talk about, which was back in the 90s, we did not have internet. So these books was a good way for us to learn about history that happened in our world, maybe in a different culture. YouTube tells me the majority of my audience is from America, so I don't know how much Americans actually got educated about 16th century Europe. So I feel like for the average D&D player in the early 90s, unless they spent a lot of their time in the library, may not know a whole lot about this period. I could also see that certain players would want to play in a more realistic, a more historical type of setting. And that's really the point of these books. Now, I know that these days with the internet, it's a lot easier to find this kind of information. So these books are far from complete and might not even be all that accurate. But I have to give credit to the original creators who tried to make all of this information accessible to the average D&D player. Playing a game set in real-world history is probably not everybody's cup of tea, but the point being, for the few people who were interested, this was an option. On the last page of chapter 1, we have a list of all of the rulers, the kings and queens, the monarchs of the different countries in Europe. For example, the Holy Roman Empire, the kings and queens of England and Ireland. They're also organized into family lineages. For example, we have the Tudor line, and Elizabeth I famously did not have any offspring. And James VI of Scotland, the great-great-grandson of Henry VIII, and the son of Mary Queen of Scots, succeeded her. Then there's France, Spain, Russia, and all the popes of the Roman Catholic Church during this time. Now, chapter 2 goes into the patterns of daily life. This is how the average person lived during this time. We have a big section talking about the sexes. Now, obviously, this is based on the historical period, and during this time, women did not have the same opportunity to do the same amount of things that men did. The book provides a couple of options to consider. First of all, is basing it closer to history, which means that women have a certain role that they played. And the second option is allow female adventurers to also be exceptional characters, as the book makes a case that there has been significant female characters during this time period, as when you're playing D&D, the average player character is supposed to be more heroic and more exceptional than the average. And it's saying, well, why not let women do all of these things, even if it's not completely accurate to history? So the bottom line being, depends on your DM and your table dynamics. Then it goes into the average home life. We have some examples of the average home. It talks about the food, the sanitation of this period, clothing for men and women with some illustrations for some examples. A large section on religion, as religion was really a big thing during this period. Education, commerce, and money. We have a currency conversion table for the currencies for each country. And back in those days, they used very archaic measurements between the different denominations in the same currency, such as 12 pennies to a shilling. or in the Spanish currency 34 maravedí to a real. The metric system was not invented yet, so this table provides you the exchange rate between the different denominations as well as between the different currencies, with the pound equivalent being presented so you can convert between the different currencies. And if you want to make it even more realistic, you should whip out your abacus and do the exchange during the session. Next, it goes through the different laws, medicine, sciences, with the types of sciences being pursued being astronomy, astrology, and alchemy. Then we have some popular pastimes such as gambling and other games. Travel, both regional and international. We've been provided with a list of equipment that is appropriate for that time and technology. And then in chapter 3, we go into character options. If you want to play in this time period, all character classes needs to take a kit. A kit is like a subclass or a character archetype or a background. For example, a fighter kit will use the fighter class as a base and provides alterations on how it plays differently to a regular fighter. So on the fighter kit, we have Gentleman Adventurer, a Forester, Clansman, and a Sea Dog. Under the rogue kits, we have a Vagabond, a Picaro, and a Courtier. Clerics have Preacher and Protector of the Faith. And under Mage kit, we only have Scholarly Mage. This book structures slightly differently to the one that we looked at last month for the Crusades, and I think that's due to these books all being written by different authors. This book is written by Steve Winter and the Crusades was written by Steve Kurtz. The Crusades book provided 3 different variations of the setting. We had purely historical, we had legendary, and we also had fantasy. These variations gave you the options on how much that you want to dial up the fantasy aspect in their historical setting. And obviously, the higher the fantasy, the more esoteric the classes are allowed. This book only provides you a single option with running games set in this period. In saying that, the Crusades book did get published in 1994 and came after this book. But it would have been nice to see the different variations that you could have with this setting and some ideas on how to dial up the fantasy aspect if you wanted to. Under the fighter kits, the Gentleman Adventurer is trained with the use of a gun. During this period, rudimentary firearms like matchlocks were invented, so this is a setting that contains guns. And then we have the Sea Dog, this is more of a sailor. A Forester is a warrior that prefer the woods similar to a ranger. And then Clansman, this is more of a regional type of warrior. You gotta remember that during this period, there were capital cities where the kings and queens lived. So a lot of these places that's outside of cities are considered like uncivilized. And then we have rogue kits for the Vagabond, the Picaro, and Courtier, with the Courtier being similar to a bard. And then there are the Preacher and Protector of the Faith being cleric kits. They have some additional restrictions on spells. And we have Scholarly Mage being the only wizard kit. So if you want to play a wizard, this is the only class that's available. There's some further restrictions like spell casting times are increased by 1 category. So a spell that takes a round becomes a turn. Once you pick your class, the next thing to think about is your nationality and religion. There are also several random tables that can assist you with character creation. There's a D100 for the country of origin, and within each of the country, there's a further D100 that confirms which city or the region that you're from. For example, if you roll a 10, you're from England, and then you need to roll again on the England table. And if you get, say, a 44, then you are from Kent. The next concept with this period is social standing. This is your status, and obviously somebody with a higher social standing will have more influence. But one of the things that you could do is buy your way into a higher social standing, and here are the costs. There are some new proficiencies in gunnery. And then chapter 4 goes into the military life and what that was like back in the 1600s, the different armor and weapons that are available. I appreciate this section because this is probably a bit more modern than your typical D&D game, as most people do not like having firearms in their D&D game. So the typical D&D technology is set probably a couple hundred years prior to this period. One thing that I really like about these books is that provide you just enough information to get your game running without overloading you on the information. Of course, nowadays we have the internet, and if you want to run a game during the Elizabethan era, you can obtain very detailed answers on pretty much everything. But the danger of that is just getting lost in the details. Say you look up on one Wikipedia article that is like 5 pages long, and then it links to further articles to get even more in depth into a related subject. And 5 hours later, you have all of this information on, say, the Spanish royal family in the 1600s, but that's probably not a very economical use of your time. These books will give you half a page on everything that you need to know, so you have a general understanding across the culture and geography of this region within 96 pages, which is the length of this book. This book provides you recommendations on some optional rules that you can incorporate into your game that are thematic for this time period. Luckily, all of these rules have already been written in the player handbook or the Dungeon Master Guide, such as parrying, weak opponents, morale, broken weapons. Then we have some information on the typical military squads, the type of battles like skirmishes and field battles, the type of units that typically forms a company of soldiers, and it even makes references to battle system, which is TSR's own wargaming rule set that you can use to run mass battles if you wish. We have a section on sieges and spoils of war. Once again, the stats for the weapons and armors appropriate to this era. Some of these were not in the original player handbook, for example, the different types of firearms. Chapter 5 called 4 Wars, and it covers the 4 major wars that happened during this period, which includes the French religious war against the Huguenots, the Netherlands revolt against Spain, the 30 Years' War, and the English Civil War. This provides a summary of what happened in each of these wars, and it contains some vignettes like diary entries or letters. There are pieces of artwork covering this period. Most of these are historical. And then chapter 6 goes into the New World, which covers the world that's beyond Europe. A lot of territories in the Americas were discovered or colonized, as well as the Orient, Africa, and Asia. Chapter 7 covers the folklore and fantasy. This is like stories and legends that were told during this period. The types of superstition, as the people were quite superstitious. The folk tales like fairies and elves. The types of monsters that were told in the stories during this time. To give you an idea of the type of thematic monsters that you could use in a game set in this period. Evil spirits and how people thought magic worked. And then chapter 8 we have some short sample adventures. Now these are quite short and simple, it's more of a synopsis. So a DM can use these to expand their own adventure. For example, A Night to Remember, the setup being the PCs hear a rumor that an alchemist who resides in a nearby forest makes magical bullets which slay their targets instantly and return to the gun that fired them. The PCs have reliable information that the alchemist's cottage is just about a day's trip away. So your PCs are setting out to find this alchemist, and at the end of the adventure they encounter some fairies. The fairies throw a party and invites the PCs to join them, and if the PCs accept, they will have a good time, but the next day they will wake up with a pounding headache, and they'll find most of their belongings having been replaced with benign items. Like they find acorns in their purses, sticks in their scabbards, water in their wineskins, toadstool in their food hampers, and so on. So that goes to show that fairies are tricksters, just like they were in the folklore back in the day. And I also feel like this is inspired at least a little bit by Midsummer Night's Dream by Shakespeare, which is actually quite thematic for this time period. And as we get to the end, we have some bibliography, just in case you want to do some additional reading into this time period. And last but not least, a map has also been included in this book. And this is a map of Europe from this time period. The different countries are marked by the bold writing, so France, Spain, Portugal, for example. And the color on the map denotes to who owns that land. For example, green is land held by the Spanish Habsburgs, with red meaning land held by the Roman Catholic Church. And if we scroll up a little bit, this goes into England and Ireland. And on the right hand side, we have some smaller maps of Netherlands, the major religions of each of the territories at the time, and a map of the known world at the time. As you see, not all of North America has been explored, the same with the majority of Siberia, and most of the islands, including Australia, has not been discovered as of yet. And that was A Mighty Fortress. Let me know down below if this would be a time period that you're interested in setting your D&D campaign in. Hey, thanks for watching. I'm working on some beginner videos to help you learn how to play AD&D 2nd edition, so watch out for those videos in the coming months. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and hope we get to hang out again in my next video.